in a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So once again, welcome. Today is the 19th session of our ongoing exploration of the Babylonian Talmud, our shiur, which is just a Hebrew word that means a lesson or a class, and the second class that we've had on the texts that pertain to the terror attack on Israel on October 7th and the ensuing war. So where I'd like to begin today is with some new material. And then if it does turn out that we have more time, which rarely happens, maybe we'll go back to last week and just go into a little bit more detail on the redemption of captives. Now knowing that there are actually, as of most recent count, the IDF has reported that there are 224 known hostages in Gaza right now. I receive a morning update that provides a lot of helpful information. So the numbers are just they tell a story too, which is awful. So this morning, we know that there are 224 hostages, and among them are 30 children. We've now identified that in the attack of October 7th, 808 civilians have been identified as murdered. 309 Israeli soldiers were also killed on October 7th. 55 Israeli police were killed. 8 Israeli intelligence officers, and there still remain 250 unidentified bodies. There are also 112 people who are still considered missing. So they're unaccounted for. They could be dead, they could be hostages. Medical teams are continuing to work around the clock to identify the remaining 250 unidentified bodies, using forensic teams to try to make sure that every victim who was murdered in the attacks is identified and can be properly buried. So that's the very grim update from the front with which we begin. So that while the only news that the American major media outlets seem to be reporting is the crisis in Gaza, it's important to remember that Israel is still grappling with the massive toll, loss of life, hostage crisis, trauma response that was precipitated on October 7th. So I share those figures with you, not because I like indulging in the morbid, but because I think it's important to recognize that there are reasons Israel is at war today. And those numbers tell the story of why Israel is at war. So that does set up our text study. Before we get into Gemara, having blessed over Torah, I think we should start with a little bit of Torah, because the Torah has the first word, if not the last, in Jewish tradition about all matters, including the ethics of war. So what I'd like to do is we're going to open up a browser window with Sefaria, our friendly directory of all texts Jewish, really just an extraordinary resource. If you're not familiar, or if you're joining our Talmud class for the first time this fall and haven't yet been introduced to sefaria.org, that's sefaria.org, it is an absolutely invaluable resource. It's just amazing. We're going to look at chapter 20 of the book of Deuteronomy. So you could have by your side a print copy of a TaNaKh, of a Hebrew Bible, and also follow along. But Sefaria community translation, and the translation that is used here, which is the Jewish Publication Society translation from the most recent edition in 2006, is an excellent translation. It's the one we use at WRT for our own study needs. So I'm going to bring up on screen chapter 20 of the book of Deuteronomy, and that's where we're going to begin our study today. Ki tetzei lamilchama al oivecha. Literally, when you go out to war. So this is the opening phrase of the passage. The whole chapter delves into the subject of war. When you go out to war, al oivecha, against your enemy, Vira'ita, and you see, sus, a sus is a horse, varechev, a rechev is a chariot, Rav mimacha, which literally means a people or forces greater than yours. Rav mimacha, greater than yours. Lo tiramehem, do not fear them. Ki, because, for Adonai Elohecha imach, Adonai your God is with you. And then it goes on to say, Hama'alcha me'eretz Mitzrayim, the one who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So we're getting reintroduced to the warrior God as God is depicted in the 15th chapter of the book of Exodus, when the Israelites are released on the final night of the 10 plagues, the death of the firstborn. The Israelites go free. They, of course, are chased to the edge of the sea. The sea is split with the miracle of God and Moses' leadership and Miriam's leadership, and the Israelites cross the Red Sea, and then the sea encloses around the pursuing enemy. And the Israelites do what victorious armies have done since the earliest times of civilization. They sing. And so there's this battle song that includes the memorable phrase, Adonai ish milchama. Adonai is a man of war, or an ish milchama, literally, a better translation is a warrior. Ish, although it is the Hebrew word for a man, it does not always imply masculine gender the way it is used. We've become very sensitive to the nuances of our language, particularly around gender. And yet, when you read, for instance, even in a relatively recent 20th century work of Jewish text and theology by Abraham Joshua Heschel, God in Search of Man, he's not talking about a male, he's talking about God in search of a human being. So until recently, one could use the word man to just mean genderless humanity or collective humanity. We don't do that anymore. And there are reasons we don't do that anymore. Nevertheless, we should be careful that when we're translating Adonai ish milchama, that we're not necessarily implying that God has masculine form or masculine attributes. So the warrior God, the image of Adonai, the God of the Hebrew people, Yahweh, the deity of the ancient Israelites, as a warrior, may come across as jarring to us 21st century non-Israelites, Jews, but not immersed in the biblical milieu out of which this literature arose. But it is entirely reasonable to conclude that for the Israelite people, having a warrior God on their side was a reason to feel strengthened as they went into battle. So have no fear, for your God, Yahweh, Adonai, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is with you. Almost where that reminder, God did this before, God can do it again. And Deuteronomy, the whole framework of the book of Deuteronomy is a population that is already landed in Eretz Yisrael, that is already settled in the promised land. Although it is written in the kind of conditional future tense, it proposes that Moses gathered the Israelites before they crossed the Jordan to conquer and inhabit the land promised on oath to their ancestors by God. The scholarly community is completely aligned in its consensus that the book of Deuteronomy was chiefly composed somewhere in the 7th century, the latter part of the 7th century BCE, during a time of great upheaval for the Jewish people and the Jewish community. Less than a century after the displacement and conquest of the northern tribes of Israel at the hands of the Assyrian Empire, and less than half a century away from when the Babylonian Empire would conquer and displace the population and the leadership in Judah, the southern kingdom of the Israelite nation. So this is a very tenuous time in Jewish tradition. At that time, the book of Deuteronomy is composed, and although it purports to be Moses's swan song or farewell sermon to the Israelite community, it was almost certainly written by Israelite officials of high rank and station in and around the environs of Jerusalem, very tied to the monarchy and the Jerusalemite priesthood. And it proposes that everything Moses was giving to the Israelites by way of pep talk and cautionary language and rules and regulations for how they would live when they get to the promised land, which is why I say the book of Deuteronomy's frame is in the conditional future. when you get to the promised land, here are the things that God will have you do. That's the syntax that informs the whole book of Deuteronomy. The actual writing of it is from a time and place when the Israelites were already in the land. And as it were, the conceit, it's a literary conceit that this is what Moses told us to do. And in some cases, we did it faithfully, and in other cases, not so much, both of which explain why things are the way they are today, where today means the latter part of the 7th century BCE. Now, everything I've just described for you requires a considerable amount of mental jujitsu. So I want J-E-W jitsu. So I want to just pause for a moment and invite you, if you have any questions, just about how we understand what the book of Deuteronomy is about and how it came to be, as well as what it tells you it's about, which is, again, the farewell sermon of Moses to the Israelite community before they enter the promised land. Any questions so far? Good, that means I've been clear as a bell. Mom and Dad, you can ask a question.
When did the description of God as Adonai Tsevaot, God of the army, come about?
Yeah, probably really, really old, though I couldn't give you, date and century, let alone chapter and verse. But Adonai Tsevaot, I think it's in the prophets, so it's a biblical phrase. I'm not sure it's in the 5 books of Moses, but that's an easily find-outable question. So somebody who's adept with Sepharia, who has who wants to do a little concordance work on Tsevaot, which literally means God of the armies. We usually say, "Oh Lord God of hosts." Hosts are armies. It's not like a host at a dinner party. Okay, so in this case, a host in this case means a battalion, God of the battalions. It's definitely in the prophetic literature, though, probably in 1st Isaiah. That's my guess, which means that it's 8th or 9th century BCE, and that may not be the first time that it was used. So, yeah, I mean, images of God as warrior or deity as warrior are also not necessarily indigenous to the Israelite civilization, right? There are all sorts of civilizations from the ancient world that predate Israelite civilization, where the idea of God or the deity in military guise, in the role of military commander, is well attested throughout the ancient Near East. So you can't dissociate Israelite literature from its larger Near Eastern context, where the idea of a warrior god was well known. And then it transfers over into the whole Greco-Roman world, right? So the Roman society, for instance, which was highly militaristic, most of its gods and goddesses go to battle. But it's much older than that. You have it in the Gilgamesh epics from Sumer, from ancient Mesopotamia. So there's all sorts of literatures and traditions that depict the deity or deities in the guise of the warrior. Okay, so anyway, all of this is a conditional phrase leading to further comment. So when you go out to do war with your enemy, and you see their horses, chariots, and troops who are more numerous than yours, do not fear them, because Adonai your God is with you, the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And then there's this fascinating passage, V'haya ki koravchem, which is really interesting, el hamilchama. So it literally means, and then, just before you go to battle, the nigasha kohen, the kohen should come out, should approach, the diber el ha'am, and make a speech to the people. So the high priest comes forward, according to this text, and addresses the people as follows. The Amar Alehem, he says to them, Shema Yisrael. And you're like, oh, I know that phrase. The book of Deuteronomy actually uses the words Shema Yisrael all the time. There are all sorts of important edicts, laws, rules that are communicated with the preamble phrase Shema Yisrael, which just means listen up, O Jews. Hey, pay attention. Shema Yisrael, atem krevim hayom lamilchama. Today you are about to go into war, al oivechem, against your enemies. Al yerach levavachem. Let your hearts not be weak. So don't falter. Literally, let your hearts not falter. They hear it says, let your courage not falter, but the word is levavchem, which means your heart. B'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha, like from the Ve'ahavta, also Deuteronomy. Al tira'u ve'al tachpezu ve'al ta'artzu mipanehem. Do not be in fear, don't panic, and don't stand in dread of them. So another pep talk from the priest, and again, the same rationale provided, Ki Adonai Elohechem ha'holech imachem, for it is Adonai, your God, who goes out with you. Sorry, my phone's ringing. I don't know who's calling. They'll leave a message. Lehi lachem lachem. So it is God who is going out with you to do battle for you. Im oivechem, with your enemies, lehoshia etchem, in order to save you. Or here they say, to bring you victory. So before we get into the kind of secondary part of the priest's pep talk to the Israelites, I see Russell's hand.
Thank you very much. I'm focusing on the reference to horses and chariots. It says when you go out into battle and meet horses and chariots, what it suggests to me, they're talking about stuff. They're talking about equipment. The other side is going to have equipment, but you yourself are the warrior. It's saying the others may have equipment, but it is, in other words, it's your person. And it makes me think that this is actually a metaphor for something other than an actual war. Yet it is your person. The priest is going to intervene and remind you of what you're doing battle with is something very different from what the other side is doing battle with. And what you're bringing as your arm is something very different from what the other side is bringing with arm. It impresses me as sort of an apples and oranges kind of battle, which suggests to me that it is a metaphor for some other kind of chemical reaction.
I love your framework for this. It does prompt some thinking on my part that, yes, I think that there is a distinct contrast being drawn in this literature between what the enemy has got and what the Israelites have got, right? The enemy has fearsome forces, horses, chariots, armies. The Israelites have Yahweh. And so, yes, I love your comment that this is apples and oranges. And by the way, even as we can acknowledge that in this text, it would not be wrong for us to feel a little bit unsettled by this, in that effectively this is a battle-proven tactic of defeating the enemy, not with superior forces, but with religious belief. Right. I mean, we have that going on right now, and that makes it a little bit complicated, that Hamas is an explicitly jihadist organization that has framed its brutal attack on Israel as the carrying out of a holy war that has been commanded by God, whom they call Allah, but it's the same God as El or Elohim. It's the same words, just in Arabic. Their God commands Hamas forces to destroy the Jews and the Jewish state. And their literature is replete with phrases Yitbach al Yehud, which in Arabic means slaughter the Jew. That is, and when Hamas spoke out about its motives for the attack on October 7th, it didn't equivocate. It didn't say, yeah, we're trying to liberate the Palestinian people from occupation in the West Bank, or because there's a naval blockade in Gaza, or because the situation of ordinary Palestinians is one of misery, or because Israel hasn't made peace, or because, the Israeli army brutalizes our people, all of which may contain elements of truth, but none of that motivates Hamas. Hamas's exclusive motivation in the current war, as they described on October 7th, is to liberate Al-Aqsa, which is the chief Muslim shrine. It's the chief Islamic shrine in Israel. It's what we call the Temple Mount. It's not the Dome of the Rock, the golden shrine that is the most familiar image associated with the skyline, as it were, of Jerusalem, which isn't very towering, but you know what I'm talking about. It's the dull gray pewtery mosque. That's the actual holy site for Muslims. It is the third most venerated mosque or shrine landmark in the Muslim world, after the Kaaba in Mecca and another mosque in Medina. Then you have Al-Aqsa. And so Hamas's intention is to perpetrate holy war on not just the Israeli nation, but on the Jewish people, and in particular to extirpate the Jewish presence from what they believe is the land designated for them. When they say free Palestine, or Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea, they're talking about from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, there should not be any Jewish presence there. So all of this is a way of saying that this might make us a little bit uncomfortable because, you know, what was Bob Dylan's, one of his earliest folk songs was called With God on Our Side. And it kind of plays with the idea that, well, every from the beginning of time, every fighting force has claimed God on their side, right? So the Israelites do in Deuteronomy chapter 20, but so does Hamas in 2023. Judy, did you have a hand up? Were there other comments that were going to come through? Okay. So let's see what the priest has to say to the people, and then we will get to some Gemara that kind of tackles these verses, but without the text first from the Torah, it's going to be hard to understand what the Talmud is referring to. The Talmud is going to actually quote some of the verses we're looking at today. So that's why I wanted to start with Torah. Always good to start with Torah. Okay, so what does the priest have to say after the pep talk? Because there's more. Then the officials, so the priest steps back. So the priest's official role is to say, hey, Israelites, God's on your side. But now the officials, who are, we might think of them as civil officials, they're not going to speak in God-saturated language. They're not there to give a religious pep talk. They're there to talk about brass tacks. V'dibru hashotrim el ha'am lemor. So then the officials, the military captains, shall speak to the people as follows. Mi ha'ish asher bana bayit chadash. Is there a guy or a person here, and presumably ish probably does mean men, because only men in biblical times were conscripted to war in the Israelite community. Is there a man here who has built a new house? Velo chanacho. And this is an interesting word. If it looks like Hanukkah, that's correct. It means to dedicate it. So to dedicate a house is to do a Hanukkah on it. We probably know this because what did the Maccabees do when they found the ruined or desecrated temple that had been in the hands of Antiochus's forces, the enemy? They rededicated the temple in the name of their god. They did a Hanukkah. That's why we call the December Festival of Lights Hanukkah. So have you built a new house but have not dedicated it? In modern Jewish practice, the way you dedicate a house is you put a mezuzah up. Sidebar. A congregant called me and Cantor Kleinman yesterday to say, I feel conflicted about this. I'm thinking of hiding my mezuzah. Just so you understand what real Jews, you know, across seas and oceans are thinking about these days and the ripple effect of what's happening in Israel. And they wanted to know, what's the Jewish law about hiding or removing a mezuzah? The answer is you're not supposed to. The answer is also that historically we do have examples of Jewish families that, for similar reasons, out of fear of being either vandalized or attacked, have moved their mezuzah inside so that it's not visible on the outside door, but have dedicated their home just inside where it's out of sight from somebody outside the house. Judy?
Rabbi Timoner from Beth Elohim wrote an amazing piece in the New York Times. I keep going back to the op-ed, but there's a lot there that we love and that we don't love. But the title was, "Do not remove your mezuzah from your door, wear your Jewish star, show who you are, you're high." But she did it. It was a very, very well done, well written, and a piece that is very inspirational piece. Do not remove your mezuzah. So
I'm going to share that with the congregant.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Judy. Okay, so reading on. So have you built a house but have not yet dedicated it? Then the officials say, Yelech v'yashov leveito. Okay, that person can go back home. Pen yamut b'milchama, lest he die in battle, v'ish acher yachnechenu. A very kind of grim thought. Maybe somebody else is going to dedicate that house if you die in battle. So go home, do your religious duty, do your home duty. And amplifying the theme, it goes on to say, is there anyone who planted a vineyard but has never harvested it? Let him go back to his home lest he die in battle and another person harvest it. And here's the whopper. Is there anyone who has paid the dowry or the bride price for a wife, but who has not yet taken her into his household? Let him go back to his home lest he die in battle and another man take her into his household as a wife. Okay, so 3 conditions that permit exemption from military service, even on the brink of battle. You have a new house, you have a new vineyard, you have a new bride. You're exempt. Reading on, the officials shall go on addressing the troops and say, is anyone afraid and disheartened? Let that person go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his. So this is more of a utilitarian reason for exemption from military service, because if somebody who is weak or afraid is in the, among his comrades, among his, platoon mates, it could have a kind of domino effect that would lead to defeat in battle. And then it goes and completes the passage by saying, and when all the officials have finished addressing the troops, the army commander shall assume command of the troops. So you have these 2 speeches. You have the speech by the high priest, you have the speech by the military officials, and then the army captains take over and they go to battle. End of passage. Now looking at Babylonian Talmud. So I'm just gonna switch tabs here. I think that I called these up ahead of time. Okay, so the Gemara that we're gonna examine here comes from Tractate Sotah, S-O-T-A-H, or Samach Vav Tet Hey. A Sotah in the Torah, in the Bible, which also is a term that is found only in the book of Deuteronomy, to my recollection, is an unfaithful wife. A wife who is suspected, or I should say not unfaithful, but the wife suspected of infidelity. So a wife suspected of adultery is put through a particularly unpleasant ordeal, which is designed to expose a woman's infidelity. Or exonerate her if not. But it is one of those things like, if she drowns, she's a witch. If she floats, she's a witch. If she floats, she's a witch. If she drowns, oh, she wasn't a witch. Oops. So in this case, the woman suspected of adultery is made to drink this nasty brew that contains a burned up ashes of a parchment scroll that's written with a particular curse against her on it. Like, it's a really bizarre and off-putting ritual from the perspective of most of us Reform Jews living in 2023 in New York, or wherever we may live. That is the tractate, but as is often the case in Talmud, and if I've said this once, I've said it 50 times, as is often the case in Talmud, the literature itself is so discursive and almost free associative that it is not uncommon when you're reading about one subject to find yourself in a long, multi-page digression about some seemingly unrelated subject. In this case, the related link, which I will confess I think is a bit of a weak link, is the idea of the taking of the bride, and that the newlywed or the newly betrothed is exempt from military service. Beyond that, you don't really need to know the connection, but in case you are familiar with the word Sotah and say, hey, what is a passage about war doing in Tractate Sotah? The answer is, yeah, that's Talmud. That's how Talmud works. Okay, so we're looking at Sotah chapter 44a. The Mishnah continues the discussion. Vaya kechalot hashotrim ledaber el ha'am ufakdu sarei tzivaot. There's that word tzivaot, but that of course is in the Torah itself, but it doesn't say Adonai tzivaot. But just to my dad's point, there's the army. Sarei tzivaot means the army captains. Berosh ha'am. So that's the verse we just read. The verse states, and it shall be when the officers conclude speaking to the people that the captains of the legions, translated differently here, same idea, the army captains, shall be appointed at the head of the people. And the Mishnah says, not only at the head of the people, but also at the rear of the people. The officers, or the station guards, are called zikifin, are standing at the front of the army, and the other guards, the rear guard behind them, and they are holding kashilin, or iron rods, in their hands. And with regard to anyone who then attempts to turn back and flee from the war, the guard has license to beat his legs to stop them from going. So the Mishnah elaborates on this idea that there's a speech in front where anyone who is legitimately exempt from military service can go. You have a new wife, you have a new house, you have a new vineyard, or you're simply afraid, you're free to go. But once the army captains assume control, they're in battle and you can't flee. And then the Mishnah elaborates, where does it get this? Who knows? It's the imagination of the rabbis. Do we have archaeological evidence to back this up? Not to my knowledge. Do we have extra textual evidence, meaning evidence from outside the Torah itself, from the contemporaneous period, that this is a practice that was done with the iron rods to beat the fleeing soldiers? No. The rabbis simply are in an imaginative space where they want to say, well, how did they keep the people from breaking ranks and from going AWOL when they're in battle? Here's how. They stationed captains at the front and the rear, and they used force of arms to keep the people in line. He would beat his legs because the beginning of fleeing is a downfall on the battlefield. As it is stated, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been also a great slaughter among the people. So that's a line from a passage about war in the Hebrew Bible from the book of 1 Samuel. And what the rabbis are pointing out is that we have biblical evidence that when the Israelites break ranks, when they are disheartened, when they are weak, when they are afraid, it's bad for the Jewish people. It goes badly in battle. So the rabbis are conjecturing in their imaginative frame, their imaginative space. This is really midrash making, even though the book itself is called Mishnah. Midrash, remember, is not a book that you can check out of the library. It's many books. More properly, midrash refers to a genre of literature that kind of the rabbis flex their imaginations to elaborate on the blank spaces in between the verses of Torah. That's one way of thinking about what midrash seeks to do. So the rabbis are imagining how the Israelites were kept in line by their own army captains. And likewise, it says further on, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines. So that's, 27 chapters later, we have multiple examples of Israelites fleeing, kind of like in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? When the knights, I think there's many times in that movie where King Arthur commands the people, flee, right? There's a lot of running away from scary people. Okay. Now, here's where things get pertinent to our study today. The Mishnah adds, in what case are all of these statements with regard to the various exemptions from war said? They are said with regard to elective wars. So we really have to kind of like zoom in on this verse here. The Talmud is providing us with a framework that would propose different kinds of war with different levels of justification for the war. So I want to go up to the Hebrew here. Bameh devarim amurim. So in what cases, what kind of wars are you allowed to give these kind of battlefield exemptions? New house, new vineyard, new wife, just afraid. Those are the four. The Mishnah clarifies, or the Talmud clarifies, b'milchamot hareshut, elective wars. Reshut literally means permission. It's a war that is allowed, but it is not necessarily, we're going to see the opposite of an elective war, is not an elective war, is not a forbidden war. It's a commanded war. The word reshut is sometimes translated discretionary. In other words, you may go to war, but that is not the same as saying you must go to war. Let's read on. Aval, but b'milchamot mitzvah, that's a word we all know. So in wars of mitzvah, where mitzvah means a commandment, we all know that, hakol yotzin, everyone must muster. Everyone has to go. It says everyone goes. Everyone goes out. Yotzin, from like Yitziat Mitzrayim, to go out, meaning to go out to battle, which, by the way, is the same word that is used at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 20 that we just read, ki teitzei la milchama, when you go out to battle. So we would use the word muster. Everyone musters. So two different kinds of wars. You have a milchemet reshut, or plural milchamot reshut, hareshut, meaning wars that are discretionary or elective. They are permitted, but they are not commanded. The other kind of war is a milchemet mitzvah, a war that is required. You must go to war. Mitzvah isn't a good deed, although that is usually the way it is colloquially translated. A mitzvah means a commandment, right? So that which is mitzvah is obligatory. So elective war, obligatory war. Afilu chatan, we'll go into the English here, but in wars whose mandate is a mitzvah, wars that are obligatory, everyone must muster, everyone goes, even a groom from his room and a bride from her wedding canopy. So if you are called up for a milchemet mitzvah, an obligatory war, you must go, even if you are standing at the chuppah. Like, it's time. And fascinating, by the way, that it would say a bride from her wedding canopy, implying that maybe the bride has military service too, but that would surprise me. I think it simply is a way of saying the groom leaves the bride at the chuppah and goes to war at the moment that a milchemet mitzvah, an obligatory war, is declared. Now, as is the way of Talmud, this is not the last word. This is the introduction to a section. And Rabbi Yehuda, one of the prominent sages, and remember in Sefaria, when I float my cursor over the name of a speaking figure in the literature, I click on it, and then I slide over to the side. And we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli, a fifth generation TaNaKh, meaning he's a Mishnaic sage from the early period of the rabbinic community. And then his little bio is there. They don't have a photo of him, but one of the most prolific scholars of the Mishnaic period, cited almost 3,000 times in the Tanaitic literature, meaning the early rabbinic literature, the layer of rabbinic literature corresponding to the composition and collation of the Mishnah. So from the year 0 to about the year 235 of the Common Era. So you learn a little bit about who's saying this. Rabbi Yehuda said, in what case are all of these statements with regard to the various exemptions from war said? So he's asking the same question that the Mishnah is asking. In what case are all of these statements said? The Mishnah says, this pertains to elective wars. Just to summarize the point here, in an elective war, exemptions are provided. In a obligatory war, in a milchemet mitzvah, exemptions are not provided. Even a groom must be summoned to the front from his very chuppah. Rabbi Yehuda has a different take. In fact, it is the inverse. It's the opposite. He says, no, these exemptions pertain to milchemet mitzvah, to wars whose mandate is a mitzvah, but in obligatory wars, everyone goes, even a groom from his room and a bride from her wedding canopy. So wait a minute. I thought that, Blake, you've been translating mitzvah as obligatory. So what's happening here? We're introduced to a new word. So he's saying you have exemptions in a milchamot mitzvah. Aval, the milchamot chova. So he's introduced a third layer, a third category of war. So now I'm going to have to change my language, which I apologize for confusing you. I did not realize that I should not be translating mitzvah as obligatory. Mitzvah means mitzvah. So you have wars that are elective, harashut. You have wars that are commanded, mitzvah. And you have wars that are chova, you must. And apparently, according to at least one rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda, there's a difference between a milchemet mitzvah and a milchemet chova. A milchemet mitzvah means it's a mitzvah to do it, but apparently exemptions are provided in his opinion. But a milchemet chova, this is an absolute obligation, you must go. Even without getting too stuck in the nuances, which I will be the first to confess in front of you are confusing. They are confusing to me. And I don't think we'll ever get to a definitive definition of these three categories of biblical war. I should say, three categories of the way the Mishnah and the Talmud understood biblical war, separated as they were by many centuries. They're looking back at these wars, but of course they're looking at them with an eye toward what would happen today. It's all speculative for a number of reasons. One, there's no archaeological or extra-textual evidence to prove that there was a difference between mitzvah, chovah, and reshut. And on top of that, the rabbinic community is writing from a time and perspective where there is no Israelite army. Right? So a lot of what the Mishnah and the Talmud is grappling with is the condition of a Jewish people that has been, basically subjugated by the Roman Empire. By the time Rabbi Yehuda was writing, it was probably concurrent with or after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem, and you begin what is known as the diaspora. So Jews are not actually even living in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, some are, but many Jews are not. And we're reading the Babylonian Talmud for a reason. It's because it was composed in Babylonia. So even the Mishnaic literature, which was composed in Eretz Yisrael, it comes from a diaspora perspective. It comes from a perspective of a Jewish people that lacks political sovereignty and military strength. So there's no Jewish army that can fight these battles right now. So all of this is speculative about war. The thing that has changed since 1948 is you now have a politically sovereign Jewish state with an army, right? So one could reasonably ask, does any of this pertain to what's happening today in Israel? And the answer is maybe. I mean, the IDF has its own codes of who gets called up and who doesn't, and who's exempt and who's not. The Bible and the Mishnah says nothing about ultra-Orthodox Jews being exempt from military service, but the IDF does. The IDF says ultra-Orthodox Jews are exempt from military service. That's one of the, perks of being a Haredi Jew, I guess, especially today. And meanwhile, tons of military forces are dedicated to protecting their settlements in the West Bank. Just so you understand that I don't have, I try to keep a nuanced perspective on the complexity of Israel's situation. Okay, we're going to read just a little bit further. Actually, no, I'm going to stop here to take comments and questions because I think we're at a meaningful juncture. So thoughts, questions about anything we've looked at so far? And Michelle, you were the hand I saw before, and then it was lowered and I didn't get you. So speak up.
Well, before you covered it. Yeah, but you covered it before, so
Okay, good.
So I didn't need to. So the concept that there may be different reasons for wars and different responses for this from within this minority community, as in diaspora, has to have been throughout time and certainly likely relevant. My grandfather's last name was probably not Friedman, but was adopted when he left Western Russia, the Pale, to escape conscription in the late 19th century. Well, actually, he was born late 19th, but he probably came over early 20th century. There certainly were, we have numerous examples through history, not just that fairly recent one. When should you sign up? In fact, Jews were eager to sign up during World War II to fight the Nazis. That was an imperative for many of them, and many feel very, today still feel very strongly about that service as a justified and important war. So the issue itself has, I think, very broad relevance. And also, I'm guessing, is an issue in all populations when there is a war. Just why the heck are we doing this?
Right. That's right. Thank you. Really appreciate your kind of overview. All right, well, let's look at a few other related texts. I'm going to switch off of Sefaria to a study sheet that I've prepared. The only thing that's missing from the study sheet is a lot of Hebrew. So if you're asking me questions about the Hebrew, it's going to require that I flip back and forth between tabs. But, I think that part of my objective here is to put texts in dialogue with one another so that you can see the way in which the layers of commentary emerge in the Jewish literary tradition around this subject. So we're going to look for a moment at, I think this is the tabs that they show you on Zoom are so tricky. Okay, good. So we have a number of passages about war, variously from TaNaKh, Torah, Maimonides, and then we're going to look at kind of another passage of Talmud. So we're going to keep coming back to Gemara, but the Gemara, even voluminous though it is not a work of literature that exists in a vacuum. It's in dialogue, right? It's in dialogue with the literature that came before it, and indeed with the literatures that come after it, which is why when you look at a page of Talmud today, it's like a cross-section of an onion or a tree trunk where you can see the rings or the layers, and the innermost is the oldest, and as you move to the margins, you get more commentary. The closer that you get to the margins, the more recent the commentary, the closer to the present day on any page of Talmud. So now going considerably backward in time to the book of Joshua, which is contemporaneous, we believe, with the book of Deuteronomy, and contiguous. So contemporaneous meaning derives from the same period of writing, of composition, and contiguous meaning if the Torah were 6 books, Joshua would be book number 6. It's right after the book of Deuteronomy. Right, Moses dies on Mount Nebo. The Israelites mourn him. It's Simchat Torah. We go back to Bereshit. We did that just a few weeks ago, the weekend of the attacks of October 7th. But that's not where the story of the Jewish people of the Israelite nation ends, because right after Moses dies and the Israelites mourn him, turn the page in a TaNaKh, and you're in the book of Joshua, where Joshua picks up exactly where Moses left off with in the enacting of the plans for conquest and inhabitation. So what does Joshua do? We learn in chapter 10, verse 40, then Joshua conquered the whole country. Now, the first 10 chapters leading up to this are kind of not just a travelogue, but a battle journal of city by city, tribe by tribe, territory by territory, the way in which Joshua's troops defeated, in most cases, the indigenous populations. Well, indigenous is a bit of a tricky word, because we learned in this week's Parsha Lech Lecha that God sent Avram and Sarai, to this promised land, to the land that I will show you. But there were already people living there, Canaanites and Perizzites among them, and that's from this week's Parsha. And so the land at God's edict has to be depopulated of its indigenous peoples, and Joshua and his armies carry that out. So Joshua conquered the whole country. He let none escape, but cut down everything that breathed, as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. So you might need to catch your breath here, because this is a stark comment about the kind of war that Joshua was carrying out. A few things are important. First of all, you will notice that it is a war of total annihilation, that he's not even taking spoil or leaving women or cattle alive. It is every living thing dies. Every living thing is proscribed. The Hebrew word for this kind of war is cherem, chet resh mem. It literally means the ban, or it's an edict of annihilation. And it is common throughout the Torah for certain wars to be carried out as a cherem. Nothing remains alive, and booty is not taken because it is proscribed. And you can read at the end here, as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. So that's one example of biblical war. Here's another. Again, we're not going in chronological order, but I've assembled these texts so that they all paint a kind of collage picture of the different ways in which war is portrayed in our tradition. In Exodus chapter 17, we read, so the Israelites have just gone free. This is after the Exodus from Egypt, but immediately after. And just as the Israelites think that they're safe, they're attacked from the rear by this nation called Amalek, which becomes, in Jewish tradition, a stand-in for the persistent, intractable, ever-present enemy or enemies of the Jewish people. Throughout Jewish tradition, Amalek has variously been associated with Haman, with whom Amalek shares a bloodline. Haman, according to the Bible itself, from the book of Esther, derives from Agag. He is listed as an Agagite. And Agag, we learn in the Torah itself, is a direct descendant of Amalek, the great enemy of the Jewish people. And Amalek is himself a descendant of Esau. So the kind of schlemazel of a brother to his twin Jacob, who is the favored. So from that falling out that we'll read about in the next few weeks' Torah portions, Esau gives rise to the I don't know, what would we call it? What would be the opposite of par excellence? The enemy par excellence? That doesn't sound right. The enemy in perpetuity of the Jewish people. And here the text says, the Lord will be at war with Amalek forever throughout the generations. That should be throughout one word. Not the Israelites will be at war with Amalek, but God. This is God's own enemy. Book of Numbers, chapter 21. Now the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, and they run up against a nasty enemy named Sihon, king of the Amorites. You might have heard his name in your Passover Haggadah. It's in the Dayenu verses where we're saying all the things that God did for us, Dayenu, it would have been enough. One of them is God defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, and his buddy Og, king of Bashan, who was a giant, who had a bed that was like, 30 cubits long or something ridiculous like that. Okay, Sihon gathered all his people and went out against Israel in the wilderness. He came to Yachaz, and engaged Israel in battle, but Israel put them to the sword and took possession of their land. So another kind of war. Now, Maimonides is familiar, of course, with all of these texts. So he writes in his Mishnah Torah, which is the same large code of law that we looked at last week, in Hilchot Melachim, which literally means the laws pertaining to kings, chapter 5, section 1. And we're also going to look at a matching section or a complementary section from chapter 6, section 1. He says, a king should not initiate war unless it is an obligatory war. So this is the language, I remember this from Maimonides. This is the Milchemet Chovah that Rabbi Yehuda, that we looked at a few minutes ago when the Talmud describes. It is, I would say, more than a war of mitzvah and much more than a war of reshut. Reshut is like the lowest level of obligation. It's a discretionary war. You may fight it, but you don't have to. A milchemet mitzvah is kind of in the middle. Not clear exactly what that means because mitzvah usually means obligation. But even above mitzvah, you have this word chovah, which means you must. You must go to war. So a king should not initiate war, says Maimonides, unless it is a milchemet chovah, an obligatory war. But he has to clarify his terms. What is an obligatory war? This is a war against the 7 nations. He says, see Deuteronomy 7:1. That means the 7 Canaanite tribes or nations that were resident in the land of Israel that God had promised to the Israelite people on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that they are commanded to extirpate from the land upon conquest and inhabitation at God's directive. So there are 7 Canaanite nations that keep coming up. They're like the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and so on and so forth. And they're mentioned many times, and it's usually 7, but sometimes it's 5 or 6, and it's not always the same. So it seems that this tradition about the 7 Canaanite nations is a little bit fungible. In other words, it has been communicated to us through modes of literature that resemble folklore, as opposed to what we would consider verifiable historical writing. Nevertheless, it was God's command that we have to go into the promised land and obliterate the enemy. A war against Amalek is also considered a milchemet chovah, an obligatory war, or a war to assist Israel from trouble that has come upon them. There's a really important phrase for the current war that we're fighting. Secondarily, Maimonides says you can fight a milchemet reshut, which is a permitted war, meaning a war that is fought against any other people in order to expand the borders of Israel or to increase the king's greatness and reputation. If some of you are feeling a little bit nauseated by the idea that such a war is even permitted, I'll join you in that feeling. I don't bring these texts to make you feel comfortable. I bring you these texts to educate and to help us understand that there's thousands of years of context for understanding what's happening right now. He goes on to say, one should not make war against anyone, however, until first calling out to them for peace, whether in the case of a permitted war, or even, I would say, in an obligatory war. When you come upon the city to make war upon it, the Torah says, you shall call out to it for peace, which was the very next verse in the book of Deuteronomy that we didn't get to. So after the troops are mustered, and the high priest gives his little pep talk, God's on your side, and the commanders come out and say, okay, any of the following people are exempt. Now we're going to go into war. And then it actually says, when you approach a town, your first obligation as a Jewish combatant is to try and negotiate terms of peace, which in this case is synonymous, by the way, with surrender, right? We're going to make peace, meaning you give up your arms so that we don't have to carry out this obligatory war. More sections of war from the Hebrew Bible. The book of Samuel. David was told, the Philistines are raiding Keilah, which is in Israel's sovereign territory. The Philistines, by the way, where do they live in ancient times? Their territory is Gaza. Just so you, I mean, don't read too much into it, but let's not miss the opportunity to notice the parallelism. The Philistines are raiding Keilah and plundering the threshing floors, which is where they store their food. David and his men went to Keilah and fought against the Philistines. He drove off their cattle and inflicted a severe defeat on them. Thus, David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. All right, so another few lines about war from the Hebrew Bible. And a full book later, the second book of Samuel, chapter 11, at the turn of the year, the season when kings go out to battle, I think meaning spring, David sent Joab, who was his army commander, with his officers and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon, which is one of the neighboring nations, the Ammonites, who live in what is today Jordan. So it's on the eastern territory, just east of the Jordan River, and besieged Rabbah, which I think is contiguous with Ammon, but don't quote me. And then David mustered all the troops and marched on Rabbah, and he attacked it and captured it. The crown was taken from the head of their kings, and it was placed on David's head, and he carried off a vast amount of booty from the city. Now, what I've done here is assembled basically an English rendering of the page of Talmud that we were looking at with the commentary in English so that it's easy to read. Again, the only thing that's missing is the Hebrew, but I think that for ease of understanding, it's helpful to see it this way. So one verse from Torah here, when you take the field against your enemies, which includes the section on the exemptions of the soldiers, that's the section we're talking about. The Mishnah, which we looked at this morning, says this applies in a milchemet reshut, meaning a discretionary war, a war that is permitted but not mitzvah and not chovah, not commanded or obligatory. But in a mandatory war, every soldier must go to fight. That's what the Mishnah says. The Gemara, elaborating on the Mishnah, says, according to Rava, everyone agrees that the wars of the conquest of Joshua, remember we looked at Joshua, chapter 10, are milchemet mitzvah. They are commanded by God. Whereas the expansionist wars of the Davidic house are reshut. They were permitted, but they were not obligatory or commanded. They disagree, meaning the rabbis disagree, with regard to the actions of war which are designed to prevent the enemy from attacking. One authority calls it required, the other calls it reshut. So in other words, the rabbis are not in a consensus position around preemptive strikes, right? So we know that the Six-Day War began with intelligence that the Egyptians were preparing a massive assault on Israel. And you know the famous story of how the IDF surprised them by eliminating the vast proportion, like some 80–90% of their air forces while the planes were still on the runway or on the tarmac. So that was a preventative strike, and there was a disagreement in the traditional rabbinic community about whether or not that was merely permitted or was it required. And we're going to look at that section of Talmud after Russell's comment. So Russell, please.
I'm sure I'm not the only one with this question. Who decides?
Right.
This passage is conveniently deciding in retrospect about the war fought by Joshua. But is it we saw the entry of the priests, and is it the priest that makes this decision? Is it the military leaders or is it each of us individually? And I asked the latter. I don't know if any of you years ago read the original book of Under the Banner of Heaven about the fundamentalist Mormons.
Yeah, and they made it into a mini series too, I think on TBS.
Right, the miniseries was sort of filtered out. Some of
It
the things
filtered
that
out a
I
lot
think
of the stuff
actually
that I
was-
loved about that book. This is by John Krakauer, who also wrote Into the Wild.
Yes.
It's about the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, offshoot of the original Mormon church.
Yes, and one of the things that was so dramatic about that book is that these self-appointed, lay holy people of the church, most of whom seem to be chiropractors for reasons I cannot understand, go out and do horrific killings, and they communicate with God individually. They believe that God speaks to them individually. And they determine, is this a necessary killing, or is this a permissive killing, or is it not a permissive killing? And they all sit around and say, okay, this is what God told me, and they go and do it. And without a source of authority, I wonder how this framework is different from the fundamentalist Mormons depicted in that book.
Yeah, I don't have it. Well, I have a couple of thoughts and answers, and thank you as always for your very thoughtfully expressed question. The most important aspect of your question that I perceive is your observation of the ambiguity here of who has the authority. In other words, you're pointing out a feature that we might perceive to be a defect in the tradition. In the real world, would this not lead to confusion or disarray, or the fact that how can you muster an army to battle if it's not clear who's in charge, or even that competing authorities who are in charge have differences of opinion about whether or not you should go to war. So yeah, all of that is really complicated. I'm going to reiterate a point that I made earlier, which is, first of all, this is speculative. The rabbinic literature, it wasn't speculative in the time of the Bible. I mean, I have every confidence that when the Bible talks about wars that the Israelites were fighting, it may not have happened exactly the way the Bible tells it, but the fact that Israelites were engaged in combat with enemies is irrefutable. That we have mountains of extra-textual and archaeological evidence to support all sorts of wars taking place throughout the ancient Near East. And so when Deuteronomy expends so much ink on this subject, that's because it's rooted in their existential reality. For the rabbis, these questions of Jewish battalions going to war of various levels of either permissibility, mitzvah, or obligation is purely speculative. The rabbis are not in charge of the armies. The rabbis are retrojecting their perspectives about the ethics of war back onto biblical wars that they are centuries removed from, if they happened at all, which I think they did. Okay, so enter Maimonides. And again, this is one of the reasons that Talmud is, for me, both so difficult and why it took me, 23 years of being a rabbi before I started teaching my first Talmud class, but also so rewarding, is that it is not there to spoon feed you answers. That is not the intention of the literature. It is there to invite you to be a witness to and a participant in the dialogue and the debate typically without resolution to these big questions. But enter Maimonides, because Maimonides comes along, and whether or not he sees this as a defect, he does see himself as the greatest rabbinic authority, not just in his own estimation, though I'm sure he was, but for the Jewish community of his time. He says, well, I have a role to play here. I'm going to summarize and give you very clear directions, because the Talmud itself isn't doing that. Like, the Talmud is not making it clear who had the authority to determine permitted, mitzvah, chovah. Reshut, mitzvah, chovah, like these three categories of war, where, by the way, I'm still confused today over what's the difference between mitzvah and chovah. Like, the way I use the words typically is interchangeable. And I'm not getting enough clarity from the text, not even from Maimonides, to know the difference between the two. So I think that from a textual perspective, Maimonides sees what Russell sees, which is, wait a minute, if this were in the real world where there's no, somebody has to be, I hate this term, but credit to George W. Bush, somebody's got to be the decider. right? Wasn't that George W? W said, I'm the decider. And it was about war in 2003, I think. Like, so in the real world, somebody has to be the decider. And it is not clear to me that the Talmud resolves that unanswered question for us. Okay, thank you, Mom and Dad.
Isn't it even a more basic or essential question to speculate why the rabbis, not the generals, not the kings, but why the rabbis felt there had to be any limits on the activity of war? I mean, you could take the basic bestial position that war is war. There are no rules.
Right.
But, you know, from the very earliest, here you have the rabbis saying that's not something that we're comfortable with. There have to be some regulations. There's
Yeah,
got
not
to be
only
some
that, I think they
rules in
start
there.
from a position that is diametrically opposed. I'm so glad you raised that point. It does provide a meaningful contrast between the way even today the IDF fights. You know, the IDF operates according to a doctrine of Tohar HaNeshek, which means purity of arms, and the ethics of battle are, you know, required. Now, again, when you're on the battlefield, does that mean that every soldier carries out the ethics of battle as commanded through the IDF with perfect fidelity? Of course not. But the IDF, like the US Army, also has a system of judgment and punishment for those who disobey the ethics of war. So the baseline Jewish perspective, and again, it is a rabbinic, so it is derived from the authority and the writing of the rabbis, is that of course there are rules in war and for war. Like that's the starting assumption. And I think what we've seen from Hamas is that these terrorists, by the way, were not going rogue. They were carrying out the orders of Hamas. They were specifically told to brutalize and kidnap and behead and cause fear and terror. And so please don't draw equivalencies between Israel and its enemy right now. From me, they're fundamentally on two different moral planes. One is on a moral plane and one is not. Okay, we're going to read on a little bit. Really grateful for your insights and questions, all of you today. Tough stuff that we're looking at. So looking at the Talmud passage that I just put in English, this is how it looks in the Talmud itself. So Amar Rava, so Rava, oh, who's Rava? I'll just click on him. Isn't that fun? Rava, an Amora from the 4th generation, meaning second level of rabbinic sages. So he is a Talmudic sage. You don't find him in the Mishnah because look when he lived. He lived in the 4th century. So he is of the 4th generation of the second level of teachers who are known as the Amoras, or the speakers. The discussers is probably the best translation of the Amoraim, the ones who discussed what was already written down in the Mishnah. So as it says here, Rava is most known for his discussion with his sparring partner and dialogue partner, Abaye. He learned under many teachers and eventually became the head of the academy in Mechuzah. Don't ask me where Mechuzah is. We could probably look it up. To which he drew many students. He was wealthy and when needed was able to intercede for the Jews with the mother of King Shapur II of Persia. I'm guessing Mechuzah might be in modern day Iran in Persia, but I do not know. Okay, what does Rava have to say? Milchamot Yeshua lechabesh. So the wars of Joshua that were waged in order to conquer, divrei hakol chova, all of them can be categorized as obligatory. They were all obligatory. Divrei hakol chova. All of them agree. Divrei hakol, meaning the words of all of them. The whole rabbinical community of the Talmudic era believes that Joshua's wars were obligatory. Israel had to fight them because they were divinely commanded, by the way. Milchamot Beit David lirvocha. Really, really interesting, which literally lirvocha means to expand. So the houses of the Davidic kingdom that were fought for the basic purpose, the express purpose of expanding Israelite territory, divrei hakol reshut. Everyone agrees that those are permitted. You're allowed to do that. Which, by the way, I'm not saying that we should be making direct applications of rabbinical precepts onto the last 75 years of Israeli history. In fact, don't do that. But it is interesting to note that the rabbinic community, even today, has grounds in the tradition to argue over whether or not the taking of Sinai and the expansion of Jewish territorial holdings, Israeli territorial holdings in the Six-Day War, including the Golan, including the West Bank, including the part of Jerusalem that was under Jordanian control, all of that may be reshut, permitted. Some of it might be obligatory, in that Israel was existentially threatened on two fronts by the Egyptians and the Syrians in 1967. Now, does that justify holding on to all of that territory? I should have included Gaza as well. Does that justify Israel holding on to all of its territory that was conquered in war, even if it was a just war, almost 60 years later? That's up to debate, right? But Israel has continued to argue that to give back the Golan, for instance, presents an existential risk for the state of Israel because of the enemies, all three of them, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran, right on the border. It's like, no, it is too important for the existence of the Jewish state and the Jewish people to give up the Golan. Which is, by the way, even among lefties in Israel, political lefties, that is a generally accepted proposition. Okay, reading on. Ki pligi lemaote nochrim. We switched to Aramaic, by the way, which is fascinating. Talmud does that. It jumps back and forth between Hebrew and Aramaic. Ki pligi, however, when they are disagreeing, it is over the following. It is with regard to preventative wars that are waged to reduce the Gentiles so that they will not come and wage war against them. Kind of an ugly thing for us to absorb, that the way in which the enemy is described here is synonymous with the word Gentile. But please understand that, this simply means the many non-Israelite or non-Jewish nations that have posed existential risks or threats to the Jewish nation throughout Jewish history. Okay, so is it permitted to fight a war against the enemy simply so that you can degrade their ability to cause harm to the Jewish people? Well, that's where the Talmud says there's a rabbinical disagreement. One sage, Rabbi Yehuda, called this type of war a mitzvah. You have to. You can't live with Hamas on your border. It's a mitzvah to extirpate, or to at least to degrade the capacity of Hamas, an entity that is no less sworn to the destruction of the Jewish people than Hitler and the Nazis were. It is a mitzvah to go in there and degrade their capacity to cause harm. One sage, the rabbis, called it an elective war, which is really interesting. It doesn't even say who Yehuda's sparring partner, so we don't know. So the rabbis say, well, there was another guy who said, no, that's permitted, but it's not necessarily commanded. There is a practical difference between these opinions with respect to the principle. One who is engaged in a mitzvah is exempt performing another mitzvah. In other words, so if it is a mitzvah war, it means that you can go back to those battlefield exemptions, because dedicating a vineyard, a house, taking your marriage vows under a chuppah, these are all mitzvot in the Jewish tradition. But so if the war is a discretionary war, then the exemptions should stand. But if the war is an obligatory war or a mitzvah war, you have to fulfill the primary mitzvah, I believe, is what is being communicated here. I want to just put it back up so that we get that last line. One fighting in this, right, one who's engaged in a mitzvah is exempt performing another mitzvah. So if you are summoned to war, you don't have to take your marriage vows, but only if it's a war that is a mitzvah. If it's purely a discretionary war, the exemptions apply. So remember, that was the original Talmudic subject that we're talking about based on Deuteronomy Chapter 20. When do we have these exemptions? And the rabbis say, well, there are three different levels of obligation in war. There's permitted, there's mitzvah, whatever that may mean, and then there's chovah, you must, obligation. And depending on how strict or stringent the obligation is, everything else in Jewish life is affected. Nowhere, by the way, but what's implied in all of this is that there are wars that are immoral. There are wars that you should not be fighting at all. What would those be? I don't know. Maybe wars to accumulate treasure and nothing else. Russell.
Well, you're generous to allow me to ask 3 questions in the same session.
You're always good at self-regulating, Russell. It's all good. We're always happy to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much. I myself have been fortunate that I've never been called upon to serve in the military. But I can't imagine how I would feel about putting my life on the line for an optional war. So if you lose, nice try. The passage from Deuteronomy seemed to be focusing on the concept that an army needs to be an all-volunteer army. You know, if you have any qualms about this, step away. If you haven't finished harvesting your field, step away. If you haven't consummated your marriage, then step away. We only want people who really mean it. And I have to believe that every soldier going into battle believes that this is necessary. We may look at the war in Ukraine today and say, Russia didn't have to do this, but I can't imagine there are too many Russian soldiers today who think, oh, this is a lark, sure, fun. If we win, we win. If we don't, we don't. The fact that Jewish tradition is looking at the moral balance and the range of moral issues that applies to a war, I find almost a noble but not a natural concept. So my question is, as a practical matter, how has this been actually implemented throughout the history of Jewish conflict?
Well, again, thank you, Russell. From the period of the first rabbis, whose words are memorialized in the Mishnah and the contemporaneous literatures of the Tosefta and the Baraita, which we've talked about, just extra, I usually call it extra Mishnaic literature that is often cited in the Talmud, through the period of the Talmud, through the period of Maimonides and Rashi and the medieval exegetes or sages who extrapolated meaning out of our text, through the modern era, post-Enlightenment, Jews living in the ghettos, Jews emancipated from the ghettos in Europe, Jews living all over the world in diaspora, until 1948, Jews settling what was then British Mandatory Palestine. Until 1948, the Jews don't have an army, the Jews don't have a state. So what I don't know is the role of the chief rabbis of Israel, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, or any other rabbinic authorities who are consulted on matters of battlefield ethics or religious justification for the wars that Israel has fought since 1948. That I don't know. My sense is that they may have a vote, but they certainly don't have a veto, and that the ethics of war are determined by the Israeli government, who are duly elected by the Israeli people, and that the people trust the Jewish state to be run like a Jewish state. More than that, though, I can't say. I mean, when you read the purity of arms, there is no separation of religion and state in Israel. So when you read a document like how the IDF determines its battlefield ethics, I'm pretty confident, though it's been a long time since I've actually looked at the code. We can maybe use that as a text study for coming weeks, assuming that we're still in this mode of learning around the conflict. I assume that some of this rabbinical language and thinking about the ethics of war makes its way into modern practices for the Israelis on the battlefield, but I do not know. So, but the amount of time that we've had to actually even examine your question in application as opposed to in just theory is extremely short, 75 years. Yep, mom and dad.
To take it to a more general point, but also on Russell's very cogent raising of the question, which I'm kind of distilling to, what's the experience of the soldiers who were called to go into the wars?
Right.
If I'm reading my, if nothing else, United States history correctly, the Vietnam War was the first time at which this really arose in a mass sense and was revolutionary. I mean, I don't think anybody going back to the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, or the Civil War, or World Wars, thought that these were somehow optional. I mean, it may have taken a long time to get into, but once we were there, most people agreed these were wars that had to be fought. Maybe the Korean War, I'm not familiar as much with that. But certainly when it came to Vietnam, there were a lot of people and a lot of prominent Jews who were diametrically opposed to this kind of thing. And that ruptured society in a way which had never been done before. I mean, the consequences of engaging people in a war, which many people feel to be unnecessary, have huge societal impacts.
Yep. It is, I mean, drawing an analogy to what we saw in Israel over the last year before October 7th, you had high-ranking military officials in the army, in the Air Force of the IDF saying, if Israel is no longer a democracy, I'm going to lay down my arms and refuse to fight. Now, obviously, they were preempted. So it does corroborate that, but we have seen mass protest movements in Israel, just not right now. I say that by way of saying that to me constitutes ample proof that from the left to the right, from the secular to the religious, Israel is a united front right now in its feeling that they must fight this war. Some of you were on the Zoom with Rabbi Nir Barkin. You would not have known it from the way he spoke, but he's not a hawkish guy. He was he was on the front lines of the pro-democracy movement over the last year. He does not support the government that was in the governing coalition from before October 7th. But to him, even as a person with a strong left leanings, this is a fight for Israel's life. And so you don't see a mass protest movement right now the way we did in Vietnam. But I think you're right. I mean, my read on American history is that we've not seen a massive populist protest movement against American engagement in war until Vietnam, though, it took Roosevelt a very long time to muster the American population to fight. It took Pearl Harbor. And it's not like Churchill hadn't been trying to get him to fight in Europe before that. So, there's unanimity is not possible, and we shouldn't retroject it back onto history. Let's just look at the last bit of text for today, and we're not going to get to captives today, but unfortunately this hostage crisis drags on, and it's likely that we'll have occasion to return to it in tandem with what's unfolding in real time on the field, to our horror, of course. So this is back to this little box that I set up of texts in translation that give you kind of like a window into what the Talmud looks like. It's a thumbnail sketch, though. I've simplified it for us. So this is the passage we just looked at, the Gemara, which expands on the Mishnah, which comments on the Torah, right? So that's what we're looking at today. But when you look at a page of Talmud in any print edition, it has comments going around the margin. As I said, the closer you get to the margins, the more recent the writing. Rashi is not actually at the foot of the page. That's why I couldn't do it this way. I couldn't do it quite the way a page of Talmud looks because I'm not that adept with formatting word processing documents, but bear with me. Rashi is usually on the inside margin of a Talmud edition in print. As any yeshiva instructor will tell his pupils, that is so that if you drop your edition of the Gemara page side down in a mud puddle with the binding like this, Rashi is the last to get wet, right? So if Rashi's closest to the inside margin, closest to the binding, we save Rashi from getting wet, which I love. Rashi, writing from northern France, from the city of Troyes in the 11th century, says, Rashi holds that the Talmud argues that the Milchemet mitzvah, and I summarized here, I didn't give the actual Rashi, but I summarized what Rashi says. He argues that the Milchemet mitzvah, the one that we're having a hard time translating, the war of mitzvah, in which you must fight, would only be a war in which the enemy has already launched an attack against you. If the attack has not yet taken place, it would be a milchemet reshut. So that's how he differentiates. Like, how do you know it's a war of mitzvah? It's self-defense. They came to you. Maimonides, we've seen. The summary of his position is that a milchemet mitzvah is a defensive war that one only fights in response to an already launched attack. So Maimonides and Rashi are in complete agreement, as they often are. They never cross paths chronologically or geographically, but I'm sure they are in a kind of dialogue with each other. I'm sure Maimonides knew Rashi, knew the text of Rashi. And the Meiri, one of the great Talmudic commentators living in France in the 13th century, so several generations after Rashi, says, one can launch a preemptive strike against an enemy amassing forces on a border, 1967, right? Such an attack is sufficiently defensive as to be considered or categorized a milchemet mitzvah. So it is clear that, look, I lack the authority to make these decisions in any way that has real effects on the ground. I'm also a Reform rabbi, and I'm humble about my standing among the world rabbinic community. So I lack the authority to say this in any way that is definitive. Nevertheless, my familiarity with these texts and traditions leads me to the ironclad conclusion that Israel is in, at the very least, a milchemet mitzvah, and possibly a milchemet chova. And I'm not sure what the difference is. Israel must fight this war according to the ethics of war as described from the Bible on up through the Talmud and its commentators. And on that note, we have to end for today. Stay strong and in touch. Please come to WRT over the next 3 days. It's really going to be an awesome, feel-good time to be together and to learn about and reflect on what's happening in Israel. Your e-blast came out this morning. You can sign up still for the comedy night tonight with Joel Chasnoff. He promises to be engaging, warm, and respectful, so he's not going to be cracking jokes about Israel. He is Israeli. He grew up near us. He raised his family in New Rochelle, and 7 years ago made Aliyah with his 3 adolescent children and his wife. So we're going to be able to ask him about his family, but he's also going to entertain and educate. He has 2 books for sale and signature about Israel, including one that was just published called Israel 201, which is an introduction to the magic, the mystery, and the chaos of living in the Holy Land, particularly from an American perspective. You don't want to miss him. It's going to be tonight, cocktails and nosh, which you have to pay for, at 7 o'clock, followed by a performance and dialogue with me beginning at around 7:45 or 8. Tomorrow, he's our guest speaker at services and is actually going to talk about war and the ethics of war and what it is like from his perspective, and about the Israeli code of conduct in battle. So please come. I think that's Friday night. It may also be that he's going to do that dialogue Saturday morning. We have a service in the round that is open to the entire congregation, 9 to 10:15 on Saturday morning in the Temple Social Hall, followed by a community-wide oneg. And then we have about an hour and 15 minutes with Joel Chasnoff educating and discussing with us. It's going to be a great weekend between tonight, tomorrow, and Shabbat morning. And then next week, please save the date for a very special Shabbat commemorating our 70th anniversary as a congregation. Obviously, with Rabbi Rick Jacobs and Rabbi Angela Bookdahl, who is our sermon speaker that night, we will not miss the opportunity to stand strong and together in the face of what's going on in Israel. But it's also a time to reflect on how far we've come as a congregation over 70 years. God bless you all, and early Shabbat Shalom, and I will see you soon.
Hello, John.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Early Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. I hope everybody stays well and strong.
You too, Judy. Thanks to
Thank-
folks.